procurement has to earn the right, and I'm sorry for that soundbite. I know it's been said to death over the last few years, but it does need to earn the right to operate at the same table. So I think that's another thing that people need to look out for. And I would also say another one, just an interesting one, is have a look at your supply base. How static has it remained over the last 10 years? Has there been much churn in the supply base? And if the answer is no, then that's probably because procurement could be done in a smarter, better way. And so that's another thing to look out for.
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Simon Whatson. Simon is a partner at Efficio Consulting and is leading the practice for private equity firms. Those are the big companies that buy companies. And he's helping those private equity firms get the most out of the procurement supply chain functions in those companies. Simon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Sean. Thanks for having me.
So aside from a passion of staying active, we both share a passion for getting out there and building stronger supply chains. And when you're dealing with private equity, you're usually dealing with a company that is, for any variety of reasons, ready to be bought or sold. And this is where a lot of, back-end functions, procurement, HR, finance, all start getting a little nervous. What do you mean M&A? But this is getting into those fast-growing businesses. And in those businesses, they often are indexed on the product, on sales, on delivery, but procurement, that supply chain function, is often one of those like, just make sure we don't run out of stuff to make, ship, and sell. What do you see in those fast-growing businesses that they have a big opportunity to do better, and then that's eroding the value as private equity firms evaluate or look at these companies?
Yeah. No, it's a great question, Sean. And, when companies are bought, whether it's by private equity or by their competitors, it's a time of huge change. And, the sort of companies that get bought by private equity, they're typically kind of mid-cap companies, and, they've often grown very strongly, and they've been very, very successful in the way they've operated to be able to grow as they have. And there's been a lot of focus on that growth, through sales, product development. But one of the areas that is often untapped by the time private equity comes along is procurement. As you said, there is a type of procurement function that exists in those companies to make sure that they can keep the lights on, that they don't run out of stuff. But it's not a strategic function. It's not a function that's going to deliver value year on year for that company. We find that private equity has become very wise over the last decade or more to the value that procurement can bring to these companies that they're buying.
And that, to me, is such a perfect example of the difference between, say, a purchasing function that happens to be able to go and buy things and try to make sure that it gets there on time, versus very carefully structuring and putting a strategy around the right way to grow, expand, and so on through supply chain. And I can think of a very, very famous brand that makes consumer products. I won't name them, but they grew so quickly, but they made it over $1 billion, and they still have like one poor guy in procurement and supply chain. And there is no way that one person can do the job that $1 billion company needs them to do. And they're leaving so much money on the table.
They will be. I don't know this particular case you're mentioning, but that will be the case. And you can bet your bottom dollar that guy is going to be massively reactive. He's going to be putting out the biggest fires, and there'll be a load of other fires raging at that time that he doesn't have time to put out. And I think it's a symptom of, I think, two things. One is often a procurement function. If there is a procurement function, it's sometimes and it's a very difficult job. So this is not a criticism of any chief procurement officer or head of procurement who's a one-man or one-woman band in these companies, but it's very hard to articulate the value that could be delivered through a more strategic approach to your leadership, to then be able to get the funding, the investment required to go after it, because that's going to take a team, it's going to take a change in approach, it's going to take time. But it's also sometimes a symptom of just a lack of I would say, understanding or appreciation amongst the exec of the value that procurement can bring. And, procurement is actually one of the, relatively easier value levers to pull because it's third
Yeah.
party spend. It's not reorganizing your own people and laying people off. It's not investing in new markets, opening factories in new continents. It's something that can be done, relatively easily. The value is often left untapped until the private equity comes along in our experience. And like I said, they've become very wise to the value that procurement can deliver to an organization, especially when done in a strategic way. So it's, in many ways, private equity has done a lot for procurement, especially at that mid-cap level. It's really put it on the value creation plan, if you
Yeah,
like. So
absolutely.
so we see that a lot.
Well, and it's such a powerful question too, is if somebody bought your company tomorrow, what are the top three, four, five things they would change?
Yeah,
And if your third party spend is more than 50% of your total spend, guess
yeah,
what one of those top things is going to be? Because it goes straight to the bottom line. And it's not just pure savings. There's a lot more to it than that, but obviously the savings
yeah,
are the cream.
yeah,
And I think that
yeah,
helps dial in and identify when you know that you are at the company that really is overdue to make that shift
yeah,
from the firefighter
yeah,
to a more strategic function. There's a lot of talk about how, procurement's brought in late or, underappreciated or da 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 da. But a big part of that is making sure that the executive at the company, whether it's the CFO, the CEO, chief supply chain officer may or may not exist. Sometimes it's the head of sales of like, hey, go make an ally with the head of sales to make sure that you're going to have the product so they can sell it and the right product. But that takes time, effort, and investment. And if you're too busy putting
yeah,
out a fire because something happened and you
yeah,
can't get to that, then there's massive value left on the table. But sometimes that's hard for people
yeah,
to admit because they feel like they're admitting that they can't do it themselves, that they're not doing a good enough job. But that's
yeah,
more a factor of them not having been afforded the resources as
yeah.
the company has grown.
Totally. And I mean, your point about there's a few points you've made there, Sean, which I'll address them in turn. The first point you made around the, you know, procurement savings, the majority of procurement savings go straight to the bottom line. You've given me an opportunity here to plug a book that I co-authored 4 years ago,
Oh,
which is called Profit from. It's actually sitting on the shelf. There you go, just behind me.
yeah,
Profit from Procurement, where the subtitle was you know breaking down silos to add 30% to your bottom line, because procurement savings, they flow directly down. And in a private equity context, if you're adding, everything that you add onto your bottom line, you can multiply that by 10 from an equity perspective when it comes to selling the company again. So very powerful value lever. I think the point you make around people being unable to get around to, let's say, harnessing that value, maybe before private equity comes along, is absolutely right. It's very hard to build up the business case because it requires you to have visibility of what the company is spending today, what it's likely to spend tomorrow. It requires you to properly understand the requirements of the business, of the key stakeholders, to be able to articulate a list of initiatives over the short, medium, and long term, quantify those initiatives,
yeah,
and be bold enough to go to your executives and say, there's 30 million, there's 40 million, there's 50 million of value here being left on the table. I need, let's say, 5 million to go after it. That's a big bet, right? And so it's a brave procurement director who does that. One of the great things about private equity is they know what sort of value can be gotten from procurement, and so they put it high on the agenda of the execs, and they provide that backing, that insurance policy, that support for the companies to do it. And that's, I think if you're in these kind of mid-cap businesses, and you're wondering whether you've got the right person in procurement, I think one of the key, there are some fantastic people out there in procurement in these roles, and I think one of the common traits that they share is, when you see them like wrestling with their peers, yeah, talking to, let's say, the head of technology or talking to the head of engineering,
yeah,
are they holding their own? Are they able to challenge really strongly? Are they able to challenge credibly? And those that are the ones that can help, a company go on that procurement journey. But there are many, sadly, who are not able to, and that's sometimes a blocker for getting the most out of procurement in that
They've got to be able
context.
to advocate for themselves, advocate for a stronger supply chain, advocate to
Absolutely.
deal with the inefficiencies.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And it's very hard when there is all this other noise going on and just keeping the lights on, and but being able to kind of argue over a nuanced position with a peer is tough, but it's necessary to be able to kind of bring procurement forwards and for it to be a respected partner to the business, and to be able to provide that kind of commercial input that's needed to really drive value from procurement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the sense of being an advocate for the stronger supply chain, recognizing that there are fires, but discreetly choosing to either keep fighting fires or can we please go get, somebody to put the matches away.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's another leader in the business that needs to stop playing with matches
Yeah.
that are causing a lot of those issues in the supply chain or extra
Yeah.
expenses or rush
Yeah.
deliveries or whatever those are. I love the example too of how an executive would support that function because in many of those fast growing functions the CFO is often where the function reports or
Yeah.
sometimes into operations.
Yeah.
The that leader is often somebody that has grown up with that company and what got the company to the point that it was really getting successful is not often the same thing that's going to get it to that next level. And private equity has the experience, the wisdom, and the practice of identifying that and going, hey, here's what we need to change. We're going to change it now.
Yeah.
But internally,
Yeah.
those are sometimes difficult things to do, especially if those leaders haven't worked anywhere else or they don't know what good looks like.
Yeah.
I love the way that you were going
Yeah.
to how do you identify the procurement director that's going to make it through a transition like that versus the one that won't.
Yeah.
Because one just keeps fighting fires and the other one will
Mm.
go and advocate for change and hold their own and stand up to
Yeah.
sometimes the head of sales, which is difficult to do.
Yeah.
What else would you suggest to an executive to look in the mirror at how they are supporting and creating that powerful supply chain solution or capability within their team?
And are you talking about somebody who's more senior? So the basically the team that procurement reports into,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because there's a look in the mirror moment for all of them in terms of leaving this money on the table while they're focused on the revenue or they're focused
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
manufacturing or,
I mean, yeah. So it sounds really obvious, and maybe not. Maybe it sounds not very insightful to people listening and watching this. But does the procurement team have a target? What is it there for? What is it doing? I think we go into a lot of businesses, especially in the private equity context, where people are not really sure what the procurement team is working on. They kind of always assume they're working with somebody else and not with them, and that's a telltale sign that they're not properly embedded in the the strategic planning of the business. Sometimes you've got to be careful about the sort of false positives as well, where you talk to a procurement team and say, are you involved in the transformation program of the company? And they say, yeah, we're involved. But what that means is there's a fairly junior person that goes to a weekly meeting on the transformation team, right? It's not the same as having the ear of the head of transformation or the head of engineering or the head of IT around their strategy and how commercially optimized it is. And so if it's not clear what that procurement function is there for and what its targets are, it's often a sign that it could be doing a lot more. And it's not, again, it's not necessarily a criticism of the current team, because it can often be a very difficult environment to work in. And procurement has often faced an uphill battle to get
yeah,
recognized by its peers for the value it can deliver, but it's a two-way street. um, Procurement has to earn the right, and I'm sorry for that soundbite. I know it's been said to death over the last few years,
yeah,
but it does need to earn the right to operate at the same table. So I think that's another thing that people need to look out for. And I would also say another one, just an interesting one, is have a look at your supply base. How static has it remained over the last 10 years? Has there been much churn in the supply base? And if the answer is no, then that's probably because procurement could be done in a smarter,
yeah,
better way. So that's another thing to look out for.
yeah. When you're stuck in the status quo of, well, we've always used that supplier, so we're still using them, as opposed to, tendering some of these things now and then.
Tendering some of these things or partnering with new suppliers, sometimes, one of the classics is, well, we can't move away from the supplier. They've become so embedded. We've become so embedded with them And that may well be true, but in many cases, there then needs to be a plan to become less reliant on that supplier, or decide strategically to properly get in bed with that supplier and make sure that you're mitigating risks else, in other ways. And yeah, we often find that, companies have not had a lot of churn, and they're massively exposed from a risk perspective with regards to some of the relationships they've got, some of the supplier relationships they've got. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think being intentional, doing it deliberately instead of by default, is a really key differentiator of if that
Yeah.
procurement director can articulate why those suppliers are where they are and how those
Yeah.
long-term strategic risks are managed, as opposed to
Yeah.
is the shipment coming and how many rolls of
Yeah.
steel did we order or whatever the commodity was.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly that.
So, Simon, I know that when a private equity firm buys another company, you are there and there to help make sure that the private equity firm can really get more out of the leverage that they're creating as they help grow the business and take it to the next level. Sometimes companies need help before they even think about being bought, or they're looking for support or assistance to go make sure that they don't leave money on the table because they may get bought at some point, or they just want to be a better run business.
Yeah.
What's the right way for somebody to think about reaching out to you and your team for some of that help?
So I think if it's a procurement, if it's a kind of procurement person, a procurement director, then Efficio as a company is very hands-on with delivery. So we get very much on the ground in the trenches with our clients' teams to help them with a lot of the legwork, the analysis, the negotiations, the change management. We're not just a PMO consultancy, and they can be, I guess, reassured that we're there to make them look good, as opposed to come and expose the things that they have found difficult when, quite frankly, fighting by themselves with very little support for so long. And then I think if it's more from an exec level perspective, I think if the execs are interested in understanding what the art of the possible is, what is the value we can get from procurement actually, um, then that's something where we can very quickly help to quantify that with a relative, we do this, hundreds of times a year for clients. We've got a lot of, technology behind this, AI, some very smart consultants, and we can very quickly quantify what the art of the possible is, and put a roadmap in place, and then, a business case that they would need to, a cost return equation essentially. And it's something that, is often the catalyst for getting going on procurement. Is let's understand what the art of the possible is here, because often the business case is a no-brainer. It's like,
Yeah,
why didn't we do this before? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's been my experience almost every single time when we see an organization really deeply inspect, there is all kinds of opportunity there.
yeah.
Simon, grateful for your time, for sharing your experience and wisdom with the group of folks that are watching. Thank you again very, very much. I hope you have an amazing training run or ride coming up soon. And
Thank you,
to
Sean.
all of you watching, this has been another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Thanks very much. See you next week.